Morning, how y'all doing? Good. Everybody into their New Year's resolutions? I heard it was like a jam, parking lot out there, and but you all made it in. And some of you are, as Jacob said, in bed. Welcome. I don't know to what, but hey. Hey, it's so great to be with you. If we haven't met yet, my name is Mark, and one of the pastors here at Lakeside, and we're kicking off a brand new series, but man, it feels like December was just totally not normal, and not a bad way, but it was just every week we had kids for part of the service and baptisms, and we had kids for a whole service, and then, we switched everything up last week. There wasn't even a sermon. Some of you are like, was this even biblical? I think we broke all the rules, but it's just really cool to hear all the stories of everything that was going on, and it was just really neat. And some of you actually got words for 2019. In fact, we just took time to actually, we were celebrating, and I honestly, Tri and I were expecting maybe 10, 12 people would fill out a little one sentence to thank God for. And I think we had 150, 200 things to read out. So that was so awesome. It was such a celebration. Even hearing today, people just love that. And then after that, we actually looked forward to the new year, to 2019, and asked God to speak just one word. We're He's a good Father, and He can summarize what He wants to tell us in even just one word. And so some of the words I heard this week were really neat. One person shared with me. They said, "My word was love." And this person just shared, that really spoke to me because I'm a person, he said, you ask anyone who knows me, and I'm a product over people often. I often am working so hard, people are second, product is number one. And I really sense God say to me in that gathering that 2019 is a year of focusing on love first, product second. I was that's so cool. Another person told me their word was mine. But it wasn't theirs, mine. It was God saying to me, what you work on is actually mine. So stop holding on to it like you're the owner and you need to make it everything that you need to make it to be, and just start trusting me a little bit more. And so even I just interacted with them a little bit this week, and they're just I have to remember though, mine. They're just sticking to that word. Someone else I talked to, they're my word was discipleship. And I'm I'm Googling it. I'm trying to understand what that means. And my word, I'll share that with you maybe later. But it was another word that I was I'm not even quite sure what. And so you can actually go back to God, as Trafina led us last week, and say more, God. Can you unpack this a little bit? And so that's been really neat to see people stepping into and being led by God. And that's what we're expecting for 2019. We want to continue to be a church that helps people discover and fully follow Jesus. And fully following Jesus means living in constant relationship with Him. We are so passionate here at Lakeside about not talking about God who came into the world 2,000 years ago and talking about history, but actually talking about a God who came into history 2,000 years ago, forever changed it, and we're still engaging with Him today. That's what we're all about here at Lakeside. And so glad that you've joined us. And as we start a new series, we're doing something really interesting today. We've shared that our downtown church is in a little bit of transition. Justin Sitzma is going to be transitioning slowly out, and by end of March, he'll be gone, and so they're in a transition, figuring out what the future holds and all that, and so we're actually helping them out because we're one church, two locations, and we just really believe that this is actually a great opportunity to grow closer together. And so after I preach here, I'm going to be going out the back, getting into a car, driving the speed limit, I promise, and then getting out and then preaching there at their service. It's going to be mad fun. So excited. I'll try and maybe track some of that on Instagram so you can kind of feel like you're a part of it, even though you'll be here sipping on coffee, which is good. I'm not jealous at all. Don't worry. But anyways, we're starting this new series, and I was just reflecting back about 6, 7 years ago. Something happened. I've shared this story with you before. If you know anything about my life, you know that my father passed away, and he had cancer. And from the day he was diagnosed to the day he died, it was 12 months to the day. And we had 12 months, really, of knowing that he was going. In fact, he had literally just retired 2 weeks earlier before we found out. And so we thought, hey, we're going to have all this time with my dad. And then it was this devastating news. And I'll never forget those last 4 months of his life, because at that point, the brain cancer began to impact so much of his body that he actually had to be carried around with different contraptions and with people, and he had to be cared for 24 hours a day. And my mom has this tiny little wartime bungalow in Toronto, and so it was so tiny, it didn't make sense to try and bring in the electric hospital beds and all that. So my mom and my dad actually moved in with us, my wife and I, newly married. Some of you have lived with your in-laws, you know how that goes. And so just imagine all the different dynamics of this. And it was actually such a gift, and yet so incredibly painful to see your father go through this, where he's just slowly passing away. And I remember in that time, you've done it before. Many of you have been down this road, and you're like, this is the person who changed my diapers and bathed me as a child. Now I'm bathing them and helping them in and out of the bathroom. And it's that you're actually speaking on their behalf to the doctors and caring for their well-being. It's this grand reversal that you hope you never have to do, and yet when you do it, there's something about it that is beautiful and tragic. And so I remember in that season, we experienced community in a way we had never experienced before. That we saw our church family and our friends come around us in a way that was just so incredible. It was like this army of people just came together to care for us. Right down to the point of like hairstylists from our church would come to our house and give my dad a fresh haircut in his hospital bed because he couldn't get out of it. He couldn't make it to anywhere. We had people coming who would just read to him. We had people that would literally come and sing songs with him just to keep him occupied and just to be with him so that he would know that he wasn't alone, even though he couldn't communicate anymore. We had people who would bring us meals and casseroles, and if you love casseroles, get sick. You'll hate them in a few months. It's tragic. Don't ever bring me a casserole. It's dead to me. No, I'm kidding. Bring me a casserole. I'd love that. Make it gluten and dairy free for my wife. Thanks. Okay. Is she here? Hey, babe. Anyways, but I remember just being so blown away by the army of people that came around and served. And today's not about cancer. Today's not about physical ailments that hit us. I think as a church, we're incredibly awesome at doing that. In fact, I was poking around the fridge, and the last church I worked at, we had this rule: if it's unlabeled, it's fair game. So like that's how I literally like didn't bring a lunch to work for years, because I would just like, unlabeled, let me serve and dispose of it, right? Because we say, if you don't label, we'll dispose of. Disposal. Anyway, so I'm like looking, and I think I asked Chris Deves, I'm like, do we have that rule? Like if it's unlabeled, we dispose of it or eat it ourselves? He's like, no, we have something called grace. That, I was like, oh, okay, we have grace for people and leave their food alone. I was like, okay, I guess I'm gonna pack my lunch from now on. But anyways, open the fridge, and there's this entire fridge just of frozen meals that are ready for people who are sick, hurting, people who have passed, all that stuff. And I just like, as a church, we know how to take care of that. But today, we're actually talking about, and in fact, for the next 5 weeks, we're talking about something that people go through that so often I call the no casserole disease. That when people are battling mental health, we have no idea how to care for them. In fact, so often we don't even know that they need caring for. Because when we're talking about mental health, so often the people that are battling it look totally normal when you look at them. They look strong, they're working, they look capable, they're good looking, they're attractive, they have jobs. Like we just think like there's nothing wrong with them. There's nothing visible that tells us that they're struggling, and yet if you could get inside their head and chat with them for a second and you could get gut level honest with them, they'd say that they just feel like they're totally outside of themselves, that they feel dead inside, that there are parts of their body that have actually completely stopped functioning. There are things and there are tasks that they used to take on without even thinking, that now it just feels like the thought alone is completely draining. That the things that used to be totally easy, now it feels like they're moving in slow motion. That it feels like, as one person said, that someone opened up their head and rearranged things and they have no idea what's going on, but it is so incredibly foreign to them. The things that used to energize them, even just thinking about them, causes them anxiety and stress. Things that were easy are now impossible. The foods that they used to love to eat, the idea of even getting out of bed for a meal is just too overwhelming. They feel weak, have trouble breathing, struggling with things that feel like asthma, but they know that they don't have asthma. And you wonder, why is this happening? And you have no idea. You're exhausted, but you slept more than everyone else in the house. You feel like maybe the best thing that you can do and accomplish that day is to watch a little bit of TV. That you end up crying for no reason, and you hide because you don't want anyone to ask why you're crying, because if you're honest, if you're gut level honest, you don't even know what's going on. That you feel hopeless, that you feel helpless, that you're desperate for people to reach out and just ask you, how are you doing? You just so badly want someone to know, and yet the phone rings and the anxiety starts to rise and you can't even pick it up. That the text messages beep and you flip the phone over and you don't even want to see it. That as the Facebook messages pile up and rise, so does your heart rate. That there's just something that doesn't make sense going on in your life, that there's sweating uncontrollably, that it feels like you're moving through molasses all the time. That even the people that you love make you nervous. That your memory is slow, and that's at the best of times. Sometimes it just feels like it's not even existent. That even the idea of sex doesn't excite you. That your own kids, in some cases, just start to feel unimportant and unvaluable. And you just wish even for a moment that your pain was somehow visible, that you'd do anything for a cast or a crutch or a bandage on your head, because then at least people could look at you and know that something's not right and that you feel broken on the inside and you have no idea what to do. And you start to wonder, is there any way out? Is there any way to get past this? And you maybe have even wondered, is life even worth living anymore? What I've just described is some of the many, many symptoms of people struggling with depression and anxiety and a flurry of other mental illnesses face every single day. And the crazy thing is, if you look at even just something like, we narrow it down to depression, 17% of people, and that's just people, including church people, religious people, 17% will battle depression in their lifetime alone. And then here's the most staggering part. Of that 17%, and just imagine how many people that is in this room, that of that 17%, 60% of those people will never tell a soul what they're feeling. That all the things we just described, no one will ever know. That everyone will think they are fine. Can you imagine if 17% of us broke our legs and then 60% of us never told the people around us that we had a broken leg? How crazy that would be. And yet there are 60% of the people who are battling depression who will never tell a soul and will continue to suffer in silence. And that's why it's so important that we talk about this. That even new moms, 10% of them battle postpartum depression. Can you imagine? 10% of the moms, 10% of the babies that you see that you, goo goo gaga, the mother, 10% of them, 1 in 10, has spent 9 months so excited to meet this baby, and now there are days where she cannot stand the sight of this child. But often we don't even think about that. It's not even a question that crosses our mind to ask. Is it no wonder that one of the best-selling books of our time is a do-it-yourself on how to take your own life, that 15% of people who battle depression will actually end up in that route? And there's this stigma that we have that what is depression? It's people who just feel sad. I remember talking with one woman who had been clinically depressed twice in her life, and I'll share her story because it's such a fascinating one of how depression can strike in such different circumstances, and it was for her. And she said, feel sad? If I could feel sad, that would have been an improvement. I couldn't feel it all. That it was completely broken. That when we talk to medical professionals today, they would say it's an epidemic of our emotional health. It is the common cold of mental health, is depression. That if you could summarize everything that's going on in the rising numbers of mental health in our society, it would be this: that our society's approach to living is not effectively nurturing the human spirit. That our society's approach to living is not effectively nurturing the human spirit. And in a few weeks from now, we're actually going to talk about what are the factors in our society that have continued to gain these numbers in the mental health realm, and how do we go after them, and how do we begin to live counterculturally. But we're going to take 5 weeks to unpack this because there's so much to unpack. But the thing I'm really passionate about, because you're like, Mark, you're not a doctor, you're not a psychologist, you're not a psychotherapist, like, you're not a medical professional at all. In fact, I'm not even sure you're a professional at anything. Like, why are you talking about this? Like, what qualifications do you have? Here's the thing that I know. That when I talk to medical professionals, they will tell you over and over and over again that we need more awareness for this. We need to be more open about this. And as a pastor leading a church, here's the thing I'm so aware of. That churches, instead of being a place of healing, often become a place of hiding for people battling mental health. And if I could say one thing, is that no longer do we ever need to preach on mental health again. I never have to preach on cancer. You know, when someone gets cancer, we don't ask, well, what did they do to get it? And were they working hard? Is this their own fault? We simply care and pray and support and move towards that brokenness. And yet with mental health, I hope one day we don't have to preach on it, that we just know when someone is battling mental health, we move towards them, we pray for them, we care for them, we take up every single need, we surround them like an army and care for them, because that's what Jesus did. He moved towards the broken people. And so I'm so passionate about that. Because I look at history and I see what Christians have done, and I'm so grateful that the first mental health care in the year 400 was actually developed by Christians. In a culture where the Greeks and the Romans were running away from mental health, they literally thought mental health issues are contagious and we need to stay as far away from these people and kick them out of our towns and put them in these other areas because we need to stay away from them because it's contagious. The Christians moved towards them, and the first mental health care hospital was actually begun by Christians. And I want to continue to lead that in our culture, that we be people who are not a place of hiding, but a place of healing, not just in this space, but when we go out of it to our regions that we are in, because it's what Jesus did. And we want to follow him. And so we're going to take 5 weeks. And so today we're just going to intro the topic a little bit. I want to give you a little bit of information, kind of get us all at a baseline understanding of mental health, a little bit more specifically on depression and anxiety. And we're going to talk more about certain things. We have a special guest, week 4, which I'm super excited about. That's an actual professional, so that's going to be so awesome. And then every once in a while, I like to recommend a book. You know, some of you love to read, and you're just like, what could I read more on? I get those emails sometimes. Is you a book recommendation? One of the best books I've written on, I haven't written any books. They still have to like proofread my slides. Someone texted me like, you know, Societies is not IES, it's Y apostrophe. I was like, thank you, Jesus, for good proofreaders. Anyways, my wife's a teacher. She's appalled right now. But one of the books that I read on mental health in the church that was probably one of the best, in fact, I've met this author and had dinner with her, was Troubled Minds by Amy Simpson. Incredible authenticity and honesty about growing up in a family with mental health in the church, the whole journey, and now she actually leads that and travels all across speaking on it. So Troubled Minds, Amy Simpson, phenomenal book. You will love reading it. Won't regret that. But as we're getting going, like some of the questions I hear all the time, we're talking about depression, all the misunderstandings, they're just sad, just need to be happier, like just the things to understand. What is depression? Professionals will call it a spectrum disorder, which means that it's just like you can have mild depression, you can have severe depression. There's all different ways that it affects people, and it looks different for all different people. It manifests in all different ways and at different levels. So, I mean, to try and just categorize it as one thing is actually doing it a disservice. People ask, like, how do you get depression or how do you catch depression? It's like asking someone, like, how do you break a leg? It's like, I can think of, like, more than a dozen ways to break your leg, okay? So it's like, it's a weird question to say, like, how do you get it? Because it's just, there's so many different ways. It's not just one way that it happens, but the thing to focus on is that it does happen. And so if you're thinking, like, I think a family member or friend, someone I love, or even myself is wrestling or struggling and I'm not quite sure, talk with a medical professional. They deal with that. You talk to them, they're like, this is probably one of the greatest things that they're dealing with right now in this time, in this age. So that's really, really important. But maybe summarize it in 3 ways of how do you kind of end up struggling with some of these things. Sometimes mental health issues, depression, anxiety specifically, is actually a symptom of another thing another health challenge that you're struggling with. Sometimes it's a reaction to life events, real life events that have happened, perceived events in life that have happened, or things that it's just like you're actually anticipating. They call that anticipatory anxiety. It's like you think something's gonna happen, and that begins to impact and destabilize your mental health. And then it's also just a disease and disorder in and of itself. And I'll share a story of a woman, I think in a few weeks, but she just shared an incredible story of 2 different times that she was diagnosed clinically depressed, and the 2 different life stages she was in and how different they were, and yet depression hit her in both those areas. It was completely shocking. Who can get depression? I love this quote that I heard once. It's like, depression is one of those things where CEOs and presidents grab hands with blue-collar workers because depression, anxiety, in fact, all of mental health is an equal opportunity employer. That it can hit anybody at any stage and anywhere on the socioeconomic spectrum, any country in the world, anywhere that it is going on. I remember reading a quote, so many famous people, and we see that now with social media and the news of people who end up taking their lives, and we're like, they were on top of the world, and yet they had this internal battle that nobody knew about. You think about even President Abraham Lincoln. I mean, just incredible things in the world, ended slavery, and yet, you know, friends who hung out with him, this is literally a direct quote from his friends, he dripped with sadness. Just imagine someone describing you as dripping with sadness. It's like you get too close to them and you end up sad. That's the kind of feeling that they had when they hung out with the president, Abraham Lincoln. In fact, Abraham Lincoln himself actually said, this is a quote from him, I'm now the most miserable man. I must die. Anybody can end up battling with mental health. Many people ask the question, like, well, what about medication? Like, don't we have a medication for that? Hasn't science caught up with it? I get an infection, I take some antibiotics, for a few weeks, and I'm great. And we're talking with one doctor, and he said, think of medication with mental illness less like a science and more like a science experiment. If you've ever talked, and I've talked with many people who've ended up going that route, and it's an incredibly hard journey, and we're totally affirming of that here at Lakeside. I know some people if you take medicine, you're not trusting God. It's like, okay, when you break your leg, don't take a cast, otherwise you're not trusting God. No, right? You're diabetic, don't take your insulin, just trust God. We never say that. But for some reason, mental health has got this stigma that you just need to trust God, don't take any medication. We think that there's something really powerful about working with your medical professionals, seeking counseling, seeking prayer, seeking all the different avenues, and not saying that we affirm that in every single situation, but we just want you to know that you shouldn't have to run from that because someone said, well, that's not trusting God. Scriptures are really clear. Even Apostle Paul said, if your stomach's hurting, take a little wine with that. It's like there was medicines of the day, and he's like, that's okay. Don't just pray. You should do that. But there's also just practical things you can be doing. So we'll talk more about that later. How long does it last? For some people, a season. For some people, a lifetime. How does it happen? Some people, it's growing. I shared my story of debilitating anxiety, and it was a 5-year process. I didn't even realize for the first few years what was happening until I just crashed and ended up, I've shared the story, on the couch in the fetal position, right? For months. That it can happen over time or overnight. Some people are predisposed to it. They're discovering chemical imbalances, all different things. And now I want to talk about the church a little bit. And one of the stigmas in the church is that, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, that, depression is just being sad. And if you just had more God in your life, if you just had the joy of the Lord, you wouldn't be depressed anymore. In fact, there's a statistic, this is true. They've actually sent out surveys to Christians, and they've actually said 30+% of Christians think if people would just pray and read their Bible more, mental health would never, ever be an issue. 30% actually believe, listen, read your Bible, pray, absolutely, will help, absolutely. But to think that if that's the only thing you need to do and you'll never struggle, you haven't read the Bible. Because we're gonna discover today that there are lots of people, in fact, today we're gonna talk about one person very specifically who was in the presence of God and suffered debilitating anxiety, depression, and suicidal thoughts. How do you explain that? Well, he should have just read his Bible and prayed. Are you kidding me? He was in direct contact, direct conversation with the creator of the universe. That we live in a broken world. And it's still not redeemed yet, and so there's definitely gonna be some struggles. So just to give you just a very small sampling of some of the people in the Bible who really struggled, okay? So if you're struggling, I struggle, it's like, well, hey, we could have been these characters in the Bible too. Jonah, we all heard the story of Jonah. This is a direct quote from Jonah. Now, Lord, take away my life, for it's better to me to die than to live. Continues, Paul, the Apostle Paul, all the schools and churches that are named after him, all the cities and towns. He was this masterful disciple of Jesus who brought the message of Jesus, of hope and life, all across the Mediterranean rim. Indeed, this is his words, we felt we had received the sentence of death. Job, remember the story of Job? I love this. His wife said to him, he went through a hard time. This is her advice to her husband. Spouses, drop your pens. Don't take note of what she said. This is not good advice. But this is what she told her husband. She had just lost all her kids. He had just lost all his kids. She said to him, are you still maintaining your integrity? Curse God and die. Here's a good way to end your problems. Curse God and you'll just drop dead, okay? Just flip him the bird, tell him how angry you are at him, and then end your life, Job. There is no reason to keep on living. And yet what do you discover at the end of the story as Job continues to go through it? That God actually speaks about him and says he's such a righteous man. That when you read the scriptures, you discover that people who are close to God struggle with mental health. And the lie that has been said that if you struggle with depression, if you struggle with anxiety, it's because you lack faith and you don't know God and you haven't invited him into it. And we can solve this with one prayer. Listen, I do believe that we can pray this stuff away. I think there's great things in that. I think there's a whole lot of other stuff that we can engage in that is biblical, that is true, that we should engage in, and we never try and oversimplify it. That there are people who are so incredibly close to God and struggled so much. And so today, we're gonna quickly go through a story in the scriptures that I love to just distill one very incredible principle that we discover in the Bible, kind of live this out a little bit. If you know the story of Elijah, in 1 Kings, if you want to follow along, 1 Kings chapter 18, but don't worry, it'll be on the screen in just a moment. But the story of Elijah is a really cool one. Elijah was a prophet for God, which a prophet is someone who hears from God and then tells the people what God said, okay? And so Elijah lives in a time when the king of Israel, the king of God's people, Israel was God's people, the king of Israel is a bad dude, marries a bad lady named Jezebel, and she's literally putting to death all of the prophets. And so Elijah runs away to save his life. And he's out in the desert, and he has nothing to eat, and he encounters God. And God actually starts doing some miraculous things to feed Elijah. He sends a raven to bring him food every single day, okay? Just imagine that, right? It's like every day the bird just shows up, drops you a meal. So Elijah, even though he's in a really hard time, he is so incredibly aware that God is good, God is loving, God is caring for him. And then the story continues, and it says that he came to this woman, and he asked her, he's like, can you get me some food? She's like, I have 1 jar of flour and 1 jar of oil left. And I'm gonna make 1 last loaf of bread, and my son and I are gonna eat that, and then we're gonna die because there's a famine in the land. Okay, so if I'm Elijah and I just ask someone for bread and they tell me that story, I'll be like, never mind. I'll find someone else. Enjoy your final meal, right? I'd just be like, I don't need to take any of your bread, okay? But instead, Elijah's like, can you just make me a little cake before you guys have your meal? He's like, but trust me, God will not let you down. And the story continues that God just continued to allow that jar to never run out of flour and to never run out of oil. And so she was continually able to make bread for them over and over and over again. Or as my son, who just learned this story from his Indian grandparents, he's like, Papa, they continued to make roti or naan. Which, by the way, just public service announcement to all the white people, speaking for you, okay? It's naan, not non-bread, okay? Because do you know what naan translates to? Bread. So when you say non-bread, you're saying, the Indian people are hearing you say, I'd like some bread, please. And they're just like, that's dumb. So turn to the person next to you and say, that's dumb. Great, good, glad we dealt with that. So anyways, so they keep making roti or naan or bread or wherever you're from, the thing with flour and oil mixed together, it's great. And so Elijah is so aware, there's bad stuff in the world, but God is still real and he's still feeding me, he's still caring for me. And then there comes the point where Elijah gets to encounter Ahab, the king. And the Bible actually says he was the worst king there had ever been. He's killing people. He's letting his wife kill people. She's just killing them by the hundreds. He's just kind of sitting passively by. It's a mess, okay? And so Elijah's like, let's throw down, bro. Okay, I'm gonna give you the mark notes, okay? So let's cage match this, okay? So he's like, I want you to call all the people of Israel, all the people under your authority, King Ahab. I want you to bring them to Mount Carmel, a mountain, okay? And I want you to bring all your prophets of Baal because they'd stopped worshiping the true God and they started worshiping Baal, and they had these Asherah poles, which were these idols that they made with their own hands. And he's like, bring them all and we're gonna have a little competition. Okay, and so they start that, and he's like, I want you to bring them all together. And so this is where we pick up the story in verse 20. So Ahab sent word throughout all Israel and assembled the prophets on Mount Carmel. And he continues. Okay, and so Elijah's like, here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna set up 2 altars, we're gonna put 2 bulls on it, but we're not gonna set the altars on fire. You're gonna pray to your God, I'm gonna pray to my God. Whichever one gets lit, they win. And they're like, okay, great. So then the competition begins. So they took the bull given them. This is the prophets of Baal. There's 450 of them, 1 Elijah, okay? A little outnumbered. They prepared it. Then they called on the name of Baal. That was the god they worshiped from morning till noon. And it continues. Baal, answer us, they shouted. There was no response. No one answered. They danced around the altar they had made. They're just like, we're gonna summon this. We're gonna keep going. Nothing. It continues. At noon, Elijah began to taunt them. I love this, okay? There's 450 of them, 1 of them, and he starts to talk smack. Shout louder, he said. Surely he is a god. Perhaps he's deep in thought, or he's busy, or he's traveling, or maybe he's sleeping and must be awakened. Maybe he doesn't have good Wi-Fi signal where he is up in heaven. Just pray a little louder. He's just having a little fun with them, right? And so they did. They shouted louder, slashed themselves with swords and spears, as was their custom, until the blood flowed. Okay, and then we're gonna fast forward a little bit to get to the part that's awesome, okay? So it didn't work. So then Elijah's like, my turn, because they spent all morning doing that, okay? Continues. At the time of sacrifice, the prophet Elijah stepped forward and prayed. No dancing, none of that. He just says, Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel and that I am your servant and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me. So these people will know that you, Lord, are God and that you are turning their hearts back again. And then this is the best. Then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the soil. Because before Elijah did it, I missed a part of the story. He's like, before we do my turn, can we make a little trench around the wooden altar? And can we dump buckets of water? And like, if you've ever been to Boy Scouts or whatever, you know water and fire don't mix. He's like, let's just make sure everybody knows to do this. So there's water all over the fire. There's a trench around it filled with water. And then he starts to pray. And it says it burned up the sacrifice. Sorry, back one. It burned up the sacrifice, the stones, and the soil, and also licked up the water in the trench. Okay, if you're Elijah, then you turn to the 450 prophets and go, what's up? How you like them apples, right? Like, it's just like, it's awesome. And then the story continues. When all the people saw this, they fell prostrate and cried, the Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God. And then, because all your kids are back in kids ministry, let me read the end of the story. Then Elijah commanded them, seize the prophets of Baal. Don't let anyone get away. They seized them, and Elijah had them brought down to the Kishon Valley and slaughtered there. So that's in the Bible? Yep. It's in the Old Testament. To which some of you are like, wait, hang on. See, this is why Old Testament and like all the things that happen there. There's Jesus, but there's the Old Testament. I don't understand this mass murder and all this stuff. You have to understand, Old Testament was before Jesus. When you look at the Old Testament, you say, this is what life will be like if there's no Savior coming to save us. People get what they get. And these people had worshiped gods and they had done things for them. There's so many ancient practices, you read about it. They would take babies and they'd have these iron gods that would be up there and they'd light them on fire so that these metal statues were melting hot, and then they'd put their babies in their arms and let them burn. There were horrible practices that were going on. And people are like, how can there be a good God and horrible things in the world? It's like, you look at the Old Testament, you see God puts up with none of it. And he just drops them dead when they do it. And when you read this stuff in the Old Testament, you see this is what would happen if the good God in heaven actually unleashed his wrath against all the horrible things that are going on in the world. But we don't stop there because we have Jesus. And in a moment, I'm talking about how powerful that is, okay? But just need to give context. Some of you will be like, how do you explain the slaughtering? Okay, so anyways, point is, Elijah wins this battle, okay? Good day for Elijah. Story continues. Now Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done and how he'd killed all the prophets with the sword, okay? And Jezebel, his wife, responds, Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah to say, may the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I don't make your life like that of one of them. Translation, by tomorrow, Elijah, I'm gonna kill you. To which, if you're Elijah and you just did this with 450 prophets, what's your response gonna be? I'll tell you what mine's gonna be. Come at me, Jezebel, let's go. Not Elijah. Something happens. Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. When he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there. He makes himself alone while he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness. He came to a broom bush, sat down under it, and prayed that he might die. I've had enough, Lord, he said. Take my life. I'm no better than my ancestors. To which you're like, what is going on, Elijah? You just had the time of your life. You just came out of the season where God was supernaturally feeding you. Like, God just took out 450 prophets. Like, why are you tripping out about one person who wanted to kill you that somehow he believed something that wasn't true, and it impacted what he was feeling and what was going on? He's like, I just want to die. You know, he's overwhelmed, he's anxious, he's stressed, he's depressed, he wants to end his life, and he's not even thinking straight. He's like, I'm worse than all my ancestors. It's like, have you read what your ancestors did? You just triumphed over all these prophets. Like, you're not like them. But he just has this moment. And the really cool thing, and this is what I just want to get to us in this story, is the way that God responds. Because it's so unlike what so many of us play in our head, that tape of what God must be responding in our story. God doesn't say to Elijah, Elijah, what's wrong with you? Did you fall out of the stupid tree and hit every branch on the way down? You forget about the raven? You forget about the roti making? Do you forget about the 450 prophets? Like one person and you're tripping out? Do you forget? Come on, smarten up. Think better, feel better, get over it. Not what happens. What happens? Look what it happens. He lay down under the bush and fell asleep. All at once, an angel, God sent an angel, touched him and said, get up and eat. Get up and eat. He looked around, and there by his head was some bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. He ate and drank and then lay down again. I love this story. It's like, of all the things that God corresponds, he's like, let me send a messenger to just bake him a nice meal and some water. Just get him hydrated. Just care for his physical needs in this time of incredible mental battle that's going on in his head. And it continues. The angel of the Lord came back a second time, touched him and said, get up and eat, for the journey's too much for you. So he got up and he ate and drank, and strengthened by that food, he traveled 40 days, 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. There he went into a cave and he spent the night. Do you just realize that God encounters a God person, someone who believes in him? He doesn't say smarten up, feel better, come on, let me just pray for you and you'll be over with this. He actually starts by taking care of his physical needs. Because so much of the mental health battle, and we're going to discover this in later weeks, it's so incredibly important to be present with people who are struggling, to feed them, because they often can't even cook and feed themselves, and to actually journey alongside them. Week 5, we're going to talk all about that, unpack that. That's what God does. He just steps into the moment, doesn't get angry. How'd you think this? Why'd you think this? How'd you lose hope? How'd you lose faith? Doesn't give him a stern talking to, doesn't give him a lecture, just comes alongside of him and cares for him. The God of the universe actually cares for him. If there's one thing I want you to realize from this story, from all the different characters that we first kind of ran through and all the different struggles they had, to Elijah the prophet who saw God do incredible things and the next day is just crushed by debilitating anxiety and depression and suicidal thoughts, the thing that we discover in the way that God moves towards this brokenness is simply this. I made it rhyme because it's a really complex statement. Okay, you ready for this? It's okay to not be okay. That it's okay to not be okay. That Jesus actually said this. I love this. In Matthew chapter 11, verse 28, he says this. He says, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you a stern talking to? No. A lecture? No. A smack on the back of the head and say, come on, work a little harder. What are you doing? Get out of bed. Why are you sad again today? Don't you know that I'm good? He said, I'll give you rest. I will give you rest. I will give you rest. It is okay to not be okay and to come to God in that way. That I so badly want us to be a community that grows in this. That it's okay to say what we're going through. That it's okay to be honest about what's going on because God meets us in that place. But we can't invite God into a place that we don't know exists because we refuse to acknowledge it and we refuse to be a culture of people who acknowledge it. So let me land with this idea to go back to that Matthew verse. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. This says two things. If you're weary, if you're burdened, if you're watching online because getting out of bed was just way too much for you today, Jesus says, come to me. Not when you have it all together, when you have it all figured out, when you've worked it all together. He says, come to me when you're weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. And that's why we're going to spend so much time in this series. Because not only are we going to learn how to engage with people battling mental health, but for those of you who are battling mental health, I want to continue as someone who has battled with this and wrestled with it and studied it for so long, give you tools as to how to continue to journey towards health in this area and invite people into it. So first of all, for those who are weary and burdened, this is an invitation to continue to engage. And continue to engage online. If you can't even get out of bed, hey, I'll meet you there. I'm good with that, okay? But for those of us who are Jesus followers, who are like, okay, but I'm a Jesus person. I don't battle mental health. Like, that's not my thing. I'm not sure I know anyone who does. Here's the thing. If you're a Jesus person, if you're a Jesus follower, if you're a Christian, you invited the Spirit of God to live inside of you, to lead, to teach, to prompt, and to speak to you. And if you're not moving towards people who are broken, people who are battling mental health, there's maybe an area of your life where God is actually wanting to grow you. Because the Spirit of God always, all throughout the Old Testament, all throughout the New Testament, always moved towards people with brokenness, not away. And if we're gonna be people who respond to the Spirit, we actually need to be a community that moves towards brokenness, not away. It continues to inculcate this idea of a culture where it's okay to not be okay. So let me invite the band to come up, and I wanna just give you a few things as we're closing up and getting ready to sing the last song. And that's just to call out a few lies. If we're gonna go on this journey, I always know that the enemy loves to lie to us, to keep us captive so that we can engage. So that every week as I'm talking or as our guest speaking on week 4, you have this lie in your head. It's like, yeah, but, or you don't know, or this is actually what happened, or it's actually my fault. The enemy, we talked about it last week, he's an accuser, he loves to lie to us. And so today I wanna just call out a few of the different lies that we believe, okay? Number 1, God gave me this mental illness. This is from God. That's not from God, okay? It's not a spiritual gift. Mental challenges, mental health, depression, anxiety, that's not a spiritual gift from God that he gives you or to try to teach you a lesson. It's just not in the scriptures. In fact, if you look at the Bible, you look at the life of Jesus, who we are told was the perfect representation of God, he never ever gives anyone any kind of sickness. The only encounter with sickness is when he encounters someone with sickness and heals them. He never brings someone sickness. And so this idea and this thing is like, well, God must have given you that to teach you a lesson or something. It's just not biblical. It's not true. It's not in the scriptures. You won't find it. Second lie that we believe is it's because of a sin that we've done. That because of a sin that we've done, we're now receiving this mental illness or the anxiety or the depression that goes with it. Can I be honest and say, sin absolutely can leave you with mental health challenges, okay? But to simply say it's your sin that did it, that's way too small. Because you need to realize that sin in general, which is a rejection of all the things that God has called us to, always hurts people, always leads to brokenness. And yes, if there are things that you're involved in that move away from God's ideals that he has for you, absolutely one of the struggles you may have in your life is a mental health challenge, is anxiety, debilitating anxiety because you refuse to accept something. But here's the thing we don't talk about. It may actually be because of someone else's sin. The number of people who are seeking therapy and counseling and prayer because of what someone did to them when they were a child, or what someone did to them in the workplace, or what someone in leadership did to them in the church is astronomical. And so we're not just gonna go with the lie of, oh, it's your own sin, you need to figure that out and then you'll be okay. It's like, no, there's incredible pain that has been done against you. And we're gonna continue to journey with that because there's ways to let God into that. But the lie that says it's simply your sin is just far too narrow-minded. And then the third point on that is actually, there are people in the scriptures who are being totally obedient to God, Elijah, one of them, who ended up battling with anxiety, depression, and thoughts of suicide. That there are ways in which a life following God will not always be easy. It's like, but I'm doing everything God said, and I'm still battling. That's a category, and that's real, and we still go after it. And the last thing is the lie that says you deserve it. And there's a lie, and that's a few categories. Let me unpack it. Number 1, you deserve it. Like, they deserve it. They did bad things, or they married her. They shouldn't have married her. They took on all that extra work, and that's why they burned out. When I had back issues and people had to literally carry me places, no one said, by the way, how did you get this? Like, were you being dumb? Because you do a lot of dumb things, Mark. Nobody ever said that. They simply cared because I was struggling. And so first of all, the lie that says, well, because they deserve it, that, you know, they just leave them be and don't care for them, that's a lie from the pit of hell, and we reject that. But secondly, like, well, I deserve this because of things I've done. I deserve to be battling these things. That's an Eastern religion belief. That's the idea of karma. We don't believe that. Jesus is not about karma. This is what we believe as Jesus followers, that nobody gets what they deserve. That every single one of us is like those prophets in the Old Testament, that if we were to be judged on the things that we've done, we all deserve to die and never be in a relationship with God. But the good news is Jesus came to give us what we didn't deserve. He gave his life for ours in a great exchange so that we could live in relationship with God here and now in this world and for eternity in heaven. We never get what we deserve, and that is awesome. If you don't know that narrative, if you never invited Jesus in your life, the prayer team will be up here after. They'd love to pray for you. But remember, we never get what we deserve. That's why Jesus is different. That's why Christianity is different, that he actually comes to earth and loves us. And so would you rise, and we're going to sing Who You Say I Am to be reminded of that. Our prayer team's gonna be up at the front, so they'd love to pray with you for anything we talked about today. They'd love to just lay hands and pray on you and pray over you. And then as well, if you're like, I'm new to this, but I've been journeying for a few months now and just wrestling with this idea of being in a relationship with Jesus, they'd love to walk you through a relationship with Jesus and what that looks like. So make use of that. And as you go, I just wanna bless you that we'd be people. Let's just break down the stigma. It's okay to not be okay. It's okay to answer the question, how you doing? With what's really going on and how you really are doing. Just want to bless you in that freedom as you go. Grab your kids, grab coffee, and connect with each other. And we'll see you next week. Thanks, Lakeside.